Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Collaborative Edges, conversations to inspire initiatives across languages and cultures. I'm Quispe-Agnoli, professor of Hispanic Studies at Michigan State University and the host of Collaborative Edges. Today, we will talk about Arabic identities across the Mediterranean and beyond with Michigan State University faculty Camelia Suleiman, Safwa Babana-Hampton, and Mark Bernstein. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sabah al-khair. Thank you.
Between November 1st and 3rd this year, the conference Blurring Boundaries, Arabic Identities Across the Mediterranean and Beyond took place at Michigan State University. Our guests today organized this event and/or made presentations. Before we start conversations, could you please introduce yourselves and your connections to the conference topic? Camelia?
Okay, I'm Camelia Suleiman, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic study, and I'm a co-organizer of the conference.
Safwa?
Hi, my name is Safwa Babana-Hampton. I'm associate professor of French and Francophone studies in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies, and I filled the modest role of moderator of one of the panels of the symposium that Mark and Camelia organized.
Thank you. Mark?
I'm Mark Bernstein, professor of Hebrew and Israeli Cultural Studies and core faculty in Jewish and Muslim Studies programs at MSU. And together with Camelia, we organized and coordinated the conference.
Thank you. It's great having you today. So let me start with a question for Camelia. In the conference, or in the announcements of the conference, you mentioned, or it is mentioned, we and the other. Could you tell us who are we and who is the other? This is a question that has become increasingly complex in late modern times due to the effects of globalization. In the Arabic-speaking contexts, it is mentioned that another force is driving this question in addition to globalization. Could you, Camelia, tell us what force is this one and how it affects the Arabic world today?
Okay, thank you, Rocio. Well, we're talking about the legacy of colonialism here, which the Arab world shares with other people, not just for the Arabs. But if we examine the Arab Spring, which started in 2011, it was a local reaction to globalization. It challenged the post-colonial order after independence and dictatorship, as well as economic inequity in the Arab world. When the state starts to collapse, the entire order is shattered by organizations such as the Islamic State or the demands for independence, such as in the Kurdish case. And I'm not comparing the Islamic State to the Kurdish requests in that, we see that this shattering is manifested in economic, linguistic, and technological terms. We see mobility of people, too. The flip side of all of this is we see migration to the north. We see refugees. So the periphery collapsed and is moving to the metropole. And that's why I thought that, it is necessary at this time to talk about what's happening with the Arabic-speaking people and boundaries or lack of and human movement.
Yes, and especially these blurry boundaries, what remains as periphery, what becomes the center, and they are all moving. These are spaces that are moving constantly.
Yes.
Now, thank you, Camelia. I would like to know from each of you, how do you approach this question from your respective fields or areas of study? Safwa?
The question of self and other, or the question of identity and otherness has been around for a very long time, and it's not specific to any single disciplinary territory. But what does happen is that every time we witness global shifts, important shifts, political, social, economic, at a local, national, or global scale, this question is re-examined from the perspective of the contemporary moment. So there are long existing and renewed debates on this question, not only in my field of Francophone post-colonial studies, but in the humanities and social sciences more broadly. My critical study of expressions and constructions of otherness and alterity attended, among other things, to cultural productions of French minorities of North African descent in France, mainly in mainland France. And problematizing the binary we versus others is often tied to a critique of authoritarian, normative, and hegemonic structures of thought and power that sustain various forms of domination, exclusion, and marginalization, and create a precarious sense of citizenship among these minorities. In the specific post-colonial and global eras, there's a familiar underlying theme that runs through many of these narratives and that takes different expressions. That theme evokes oftentimes, again, the idea that the second abolition of French slavery in 1848 and the decolonization in former French colonies did not really lead to true emancipation of humanity in these locations. It's believed that it didn't truly lead to liberating and to decolonizing the minds. There is an interest in exploring the ways in which the French Republican model of integration paradoxically both creates and makes invisible cultural difference because of the contradictions upon which the French Republican model itself is founded. So on the one hand, it perceives representation of difference, so cultural difference, otherness, as a threat, as an existential threat to social cohesion and national identity. And on the other hand, its narrowly defined view of the nation excludes French citizens with different histories and specific cultural heritages from the national narrative, in which the notions of unity, homogeneity are central. The reason is believed to reside in the continued existence of hierarchical racial and social structures that enabled and legitimized colonial rule and violence. The kind of critical reflection developed in these works often considers forms that resistance to this reality can take today in order to expand the definition of history, of culture, of the nation, and of humanity, simply speaking. And so to go back to the blurring the boundaries, the theme of blurring the boundaries, that was the focus of the symposium organized by Camille and Mark. So in this sense, blurring the boundaries becomes a necessary subversive act and critical intervention that allows for reimagining the foundations of citizenship, of French citizenship, in the eyes of these minorities who feel excluded from that, from access to full citizenship. So reimagining it involves recreating it beyond the narrowly defined categories of identity that are largely inspired by the French Universalist Jacobinist model of citizenship, a model that's also behind prevailing nationalist versions of history in France.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes up from what you just said, Safwa, is this idea, and this will be part of our conversation, whether how does this oppose nationalism or movements, national movements, towards a homogeneous, unified nation, right? But also you mentioned that it's blurring the boundaries, is subversive. I agree with you, and at the same time, I think it's unavoidable. It has to happen, and it will happen. And what you are saying, I see it in other. I think it's in the human societies in general. And Mark, I would like to know, how do you have studied this idea of we and the other in your area, in Jewish studies and Muslim studies as well?
Well, Rosia, I just wanted to say, I think your point about the sort of the positive side of looking at blurring the boundaries, that is, and the title of your podcast, Collaborative Edges, I think it very much gets to that this can be a springboard for positive conversation about ways in which people can collaborate across cultures, and that's precisely what is at the core of my own research and teaching interests. I work both in the contemporary period and also historically in the intersection of Jewish and Muslim civilizations in Arabic and Hebrew language. I look at the ways typically in which minorities construct identity and senses of belonging within the context of the hegemonic majority, looking both at the way, on the one hand, Jewish populations in the Arabic-speaking Muslim world historically, and in the contemporary world, the ways in which Palestinian Israelis seek to integrate into the society. In terms of my work on Judeo-Arabic, which is the language that was spoken by the Jewish communities who lived in the Arabic-speaking world for 15 centuries, and who created one of the most important Jewish civilizations in history, I look specifically at the stories of the prophets literature. These are popular tales about figures who appear both in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and the Quran. And I seek to demonstrate the ways in which the transfer of cultural artifacts can take place across linguistic, religious, cultural bounds, and actually blur those boundaries, and, as we said, in a collaborative way. And my book on the Jewish and Muslim figure of Joseph, Yusuf, Stories of Joseph, Narrative Migrations Between Judaism and Islam, takes up this issue in depth with regard to the dialogue between Jews and Muslims over figures held sacred by both.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Camelia, I would like to go back to you and see how, also because of your background in linguistics, how do you see this movement towards blurring boundaries in terms of language in the Arab world?
Yes. My field, as a field, linguistics, has witnessed a paradigm shift more towards post-structuralism and more towards destabilizing the concept of language and what we mean when we say language and its boundaries and what is the standard, etc. But this research is done at the center, not the periphery. So we examine how language is destabilized at the center. We use terms like superdiversity, like diversity within diversity in the European city that is holding all of these immigrants coming from the south. But what about the periphery? We still do research on the periphery that is essentialist at best and loaded with Orientalist baggage, I would say, and we need to catch up. And I was hoping that by organizing this conference that we get people to talk about the limits of our paradigms and how we could break them and speak with other linguists and with a broader field of linguistics and social sciences.
That's very interesting, the limits of the paradigm. Yeah, and how if whether they can be questioned, they are questioned, and they can be broken and extended and changed, etc. And this brings me to this presentation that Mark made during the conference about rap music and media and cinema. And I would like to ask you, Mark, how does rap or popular music becomes a medium to talk about blurring boundaries in the Arabic world and beyond?
Well, I'm by no means a musicologist, and as my kids would be very quick to point out, certainly no expert in rap. But this work reflects my continuing interest in the construction of identity by Palestinians who live in Israel and have Israeli citizenship. In the case of Tamer Nafar, both the protagonist and the creator, writer, co-writer of the film Junction 48, which we screened as part of the conference, and the preeminent Palestinian-Israeli rapper, I look to both his music and his lyrics and his film work in which rap becomes a medium for social protest. And in some ways, this is similar to earlier work I did on the Palestinian-Israeli writer and my friend, Said Kashua, who in similar ways tries to blur the boundaries, again, collaboratively, let's say, between Israeli Arab and Israeli Jew in the sitcom he created and starred in, Arab Labor.
Okay. Yeah, I found your presentation very appealing. I was very intrigued by it because when I was listening to your presentation about rap, and it's a generational thing, so rap doesn't speak to me, and however, it's a subversive force, as you say. And then I was thinking, that reminds me what we call in Latin America the music of social protest of the 1970s, with these singers who were also composers of their own music, and they all speak of social justice and inequalities in our different Latin American countries. And among the most famous, Mercedes Sosa and Silvio Rodriguez, Pablo Milanés, the last two from Cuba. Cuba that has lived in an oppression for a long time. So, and I was thinking that I was able to make the connection. Okay, what you were explaining about rap is the way I felt in the 1970s or 80s about the social or the music of social protest at the time.
That's fascinating.
It's very interesting. I had flashback memories. So that's the way I felt in the 1970s and 80s with that kind of music.
Well, and I think, again, just the very fact that, in this case, Tamer Nafar, the artist and film star, is using rap, which is a Black American, African-American art form developed here to, in some ways, lodge similar protests against the society in which he lives.
Which now also I would like to say that kind of music in the 70s and the 80s, the music of social protest in Latin America was considered highly subversive, left wing, and all the labels you can think of. So, okay, I would like to go back now to the related topic of self-identification and representations. And Safwa, you have worked on these in North Africa, specifically Morocco, but also in your documentary films in the global Hmong community. How do you perceive this idea of blurring boundaries when Moroccans and Hmongs answer questions about identity? When you ask them who you are and how do you feel or how do you identify yourself?
Yeah, at the core of discovering the stories of these refugees and listening to their testimonials was also the recognition that the processes that lead them from the moment of being nothing as a direct result of the war and its devastations, the experience of refugee camps, are very, so these processes are very unique, and they enlighten us also on what is involved in identity construction in diasporic situations. What are the processes through which these communities go through in order to rebuild their sense of identity and to rebuild devastated lives? So, to me, the Hmong refugee testimonials that appear in the films, the two films, Hmong Memory at the Crossroads and Growing Up Hmong at the Crossroads, they challenge traditional markers of identity and the artifice of borders. So they make it more palpable that the borders, the idea of boundaries, is a construct, is an artifice. Whether those boundaries demarcate territories, languages, cultures. And so border crossing in the accounts that appear in the films, in the personal narratives of these refugees that were interviewed. So border crossing becomes a foundational element of their diasporic identities. So the minutes that they move into new lands and begin to create new reference points, new bearings, border crossing, it's impossible to imagine and to understand their identities outside this notion of border crossing. So border crossing is also at the heart of all the transcultural expressions of identities, even in the case of communities that I referred to earlier, French minorities of North African descent. So whether it's real or imaginary, and blurring boundaries, and I was reminded as I was hearing Camilla and Mark's own accounts based on their own work, that often these minorities that experience forms of exclusion or marginalization or invisibility often resort to models of identity construction that come from outside the confines of the national borders in which they find themselves. And so whether it's African-American rap or, solidarities with other minority groups who experience similar forms of discrimination, we find that, that space provides them alternative ways of defining themselves and affirming their sense of belonging, and also to legitimate their histories and their stories because of those affiliations that they establish with other communities but outside nationalist frameworks. So in the case of French minorities of North African descent, there is an interest in reimagining their relationship with the French nation, but by drawing also on models for identity construction that came from other traditions and other movements and struggles for social justice or racial justice, and the kinds of contemporary global coalitions we witness, for instance, amongst different movements in France that call for greater racial equality and social justice, also find inspiration in movements, in social movements elsewhere in the world. And in that way, it liberates their imagination from structures of thought that historically tended to marginalize them and exclude them. And I think, whether we look in the area of languages or, popular culture, often, there's a desire to use them as platforms for expressing those visions that they do not have the possibility to express otherwise in prevailing paradigms and prevailing structures of thought. So I find the value of these testimonials and similar ones. So there are others as well coming from, other parts of the French-speaking world. To me, their value lies in the fact that they inform us on the specific ways in which processes of self-identification relate to the performance of the unfinished work of memory in the context of France. And by that, I mean the memory of French colonialism and the memory of French slavery.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go back to Camelia for our last question, and going back to the issue of the other. And this is a question of opinion. Why are we afraid, we human beings, why are we so afraid of the other, in your opinion? And who's the other in the works you study or the area in which you study?
Mm-hmm. Why we're afraid of the other, I'm afraid I can't answer. It's built in, we find it as early as ancient societies trying to demarcate who they are in relation to the others. Even in the Old Testament, you could find some citations about that, how groups identified themselves. But the other half of the question?
Yes, who is
yes.
the other
Yes.
in the areas that you study, in the topics you study?
It's ever shifting,
That is, yes.
It's never,
Yeah,
the
and
same.
it's not only the other. The identity is ever
Yes,
shifting
yes.
all the time. Identity is something I have come to realize after many years of working on this, that identity is not fixated. It's not a fixated category, that it's the same, over time, but it changes constantly. And I think that has been one of our methodological problems, that we tend to, I don't do that anymore, thank God, but we have tended to study identity as a fixated object that doesn't move. Yes. And that is why, at least in the area in which I work, which is Latin America, now I prefer to work about identification because it's a process instead of identity. But it's a methodological choice. So, yeah, and all what you are saying about the other and going across borders, I was thinking also of migration, the movements of migration, and subversive places or areas in which a protest or a rebellion can start taking place, and also all these opposed to this desire to unification in a nation. And then it comes to my mind again the issue of nationalism, how dangerous it can be, because it tends to deny or to put in an invisible area differences, and that is very important to understand, I think, the place of the Arab-speaking world in the Mediterranean and beyond. And believe me, there are so many ideas that resonate with what I know about Safoa's work in North Africa and with the Hmong people, with what I heard from Mark's presentation about popular culture and music, and also my own observations of Latin America. So we are extremely connected. We are facing similar problems. So I want to thank you today for this conversation. Again, we have had Camelia Suleiman, Professor of Arabic Studies, Mark Bernstein, Professor of Hebrew, Jewish Studies, and Muslim Studies, and Safoa Babana-Hampton, Professor of French and Francophone Studies. There is information available about the conference and a list of resources in the following website, globalstudies.msu.edu. Go to events, and from there go to GSAH Arabic Symposium. So thank you very much for being here today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and last but not least, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Letters, any of our sponsors, or any official entities of Michigan State University. I want to thank our guests again and our technical producer, Daniel Trego. Tune in for our next podcast on Collaborative Edges, and see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
having
for
us.
having us.
Shukran.
Bye-bye.